The vast expanse of space stretched endlessly before him, a black ocean speckled with distant stars that twinkled like tiny diamonds against the void. Mark Danner, a seasoned soldier of the Earth Defense Fleet, sat at the controls of his reconnaissance ship, the Argonaut. The ship was a sleek, agile vessel designed for deep space exploration, equipped with state-of-the-art sensors and stealth capabilities. Yet, despite all its advanced technology, the vastness of the universe always made him feel small and insignificant. Mark had been on countless missions before, each one pushing him further into the unknown reaches of the galaxy. But this mission was different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The briefing had been routine: chart a course through the uncharted Helios cluster, gather data, and return to the fleet. Simple. Yet, as he navigated the ship through the nebula-filled region, a strange unease settled in the pit of his stomach. The Argonaut moved silently through space, its sensors humming softly as they scanned the surrounding area. Mark's eyes were fixed on the console before him, monitoring the readouts with a practiced efficiency. But even as he worked, his mind wandered, reflecting on the monotony of his life as a soldier. The endless missions, the isolation, the never-ending cycle of orders and reports. It was a life devoid of any real connection, any true purpose. He sighed, leaning back in his seat. Just another mission, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. Get in, get the data, and get out. But fate had other plans. Without warning, the ship's systems began to flicker. The lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines wavered. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he reached for the controls, his fingers flying over the console in an attempt to stabilize the ship. What the hell, he muttered, his eyes darting across the various readouts. The Argonaut was caught in a strange energy field, one that defied all known physics. It was as if the ship had been ensnared by some invisible force, pulling it off course and into the depths of the cluster. Mark's hands moved with practiced precision as he tried to override the malfunctioning systems, but it was no use. The ship was being dragged toward a nearby planet, its surface obscured by thick clouds and swirling storms. The gravitational pull was too strong, and the Argonaut was powerless to resist. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the Argonaut. I've lost control of the ship," Mark called out into the comms, but all he received in return was static. The mysterious energy field seemed to be jamming all communications. The planet loomed closer, its atmosphere a roiling mass of turbulence and lightning. Mark's pulse quickened as he realized the severity of the situation. He was going to crash. "Brace for impact," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. He strapped himself into the pilot's seat and activated the emergency protocols. The ship's automated systems kicked in, deploying heat shields and stabilizers in a last-ditch effort to minimize the damage. The Argonaut hit the atmosphere with a bone-jarring jolt, and Mark was thrown against his restraints as the ship plummeted toward the surface. The hull groaned under the pressure, and the ship's exterior began to heat up as it streaked through the sky like a meteor. The cockpit was filled with the deafening roar of re-entry, and for a moment Mark wondered if this was how it would all end. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the turbulence subsided. The ship had broken through the upper atmosphere and was now descending rapidly toward the planet's surface. Mark struggled to regain control, fighting against the ship's damaged systems as they spiraled downward. Through the cockpit's viewport, he caught glimpses of the planet below: lush green forests, towering mountains, and vast, shimmering oceans. It was a world teeming with life, but Mark had no time to appreciate its beauty. His focus was on finding a safe place to land, somewhere that wouldn't result in his immediate death. With a final burst of effort, he managed to steer the ship toward a relatively flat area near the edge of a dense forest. The Argonaut crashed into the ground with a thunderous impact, skidding across the earth and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The ship's hull buckled and groaned, and the lights inside flickered before finally going dark. Silence. For a long moment, Mark didn't move. His body was bruised and battered, but he was alive. The Argonaut, however, was in shambles. The once sleek and formidable vessel was now little more than a twisted wreck, its systems offline and its hull breached in several places. Mark unbuckled his restraints and slowly rose from the pilot's seat, wincing at the pain that shot through his body. He grabbed a med kit from the storage compartment and quickly patched up the worst of his injuries before turning his attention to the ship's console. It was dead. The power core was offline, and the damage was extensive. Mark cursed under his breath, realizing that he was stranded. There would be no calling for help, no returning to the fleet. He was alone on this unknown planet, with no way to contact anyone. Taking a deep breath, Mark activated the emergency hatch and climbed out of the ship. The cool, fresh air hit his face, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the Argonaut. He took a moment to survey his surroundings, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. The crash site was in a clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, and their branches intertwined to form a dense canopy overhead. The air was filled with the sounds of alien wildlife chirps, calls, and rustlings in the underbrush. The ground beneath his feet was soft and covered in a thick layer of moss, which cushioned his steps as he moved away from the wreckage. Mark's military instincts kicked in as he began to explore the area, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his waist. He needed to find water, shelter, and some way to defend himself if necessary. The planet's environment seemed hospitable, but there was no telling what dangers lurked in the shadows. As he made his way through the forest, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder every few steps. But no matter how hard he looked, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. After what felt like hours of walking, Mark emerged from the forest into a wide, open field. In the distance, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat of structure. It was large and imposing, with smooth, curved walls that glowed faintly in the fading light. The architecture was unlike anything he had ever seen before, clearly of alien origin. Cautiously, Mark approached the structure, his senses on high alert. As he drew closer, he noticed figures moving around the perimeter, tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and graceful movements. They were covered in intricate armor that shimmered in the dim light, and they carried weapons that looked both advanced and deadly. Mark's first instinct was to retreat, but it was too late. One of the figures spotted him and raised an alarm. The others immediately turned their attention to him, moving with a speed and precision that marked them as trained warriors. Before Mark could react, they had surrounded him, their weapons trained on his chest. He raised his hands slowly, showing that he was unarmed and not a threat. But the aliens were clearly wary of him, their eyes large and glowing with an otherworldly light fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. One of the aliens, who appeared to be their leader, stepped forward. She was taller than the others, with an air of authority that was impossible to miss. Her armor was more ornate, and she carried herself with a regal grace. Mark couldn't help but be struck by her presence. There was something almost hypnotic about her, a blend of beauty and power that made it impossible to look away. The leader spoke, her voice melodic yet commanding, in a language that Mark didn't understand. He could only guess at what she was saying, but her tone suggested she was giving orders. The other aliens moved in closer, their weapons still trained on him. Mark knew he had to do something to defuse the situation. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small translation device, a standard issue for missions involving first contact. He activated it and held it up, hoping it would bridge the communication gap. The leader watched him closely, her eyes narrowing as the device emitted a series of beeps and clicks. Then, to Mark's relief, the device began to translate her words into a language he could understand. "Who are you?" the leader demanded, her voice now clear and sharp. "How did you come to this planet?" Mark lowered the device and took a deep breath. "My name is Mark Danner," he replied carefully. "I'm a soldier from Earth. My ship malfunctioned, and I crash-landed here. I mean no harm. I'm just trying to survive." The leader studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, she lowered her weapon. The others followed suit, though they remained wary. "You are the first male to set foot on this planet in centuries," she said, her tone laced with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Your presence here is unprecedented." Mark's brow furrowed at her words. "First male? What do you mean?" The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to one of her subordinates and spoke rapidly in their language. The subordinate nodded and disappeared into the structure, leaving Mark alone with the remaining aliens. "You will come with us," the leader said finally, her tone brooking no argument. "Our queen will want to see you." Mark hesitated, weighing his options. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with no idea what these aliens were capable of. But he also knew that refusing would likely result in his immediate death. Reluctantly, he nodded. Lead the way, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. The leader gestured for him to follow, and the group began to move toward the structure. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. The revelation that he was the first male on this planet in centuries was both intriguing and unsettling. What kind of society had he stumbled upon? And what did they want with him? The answers he knew would come soon enough. But as they approached the entrance to the structure, a massive, intricately carved doorway that seemed to pulse with an inner light, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The interior of the structure was even more impressive than the exterior. The walls were lined with smooth, polished stone that glowed with a soft, ambient light. The air was cool and filled with a faint, floral scent that was both soothing and unfamiliar. Mark's footsteps echoed softly as he followed the leader and her warriors down a long corridor, their path illuminated by the shimmering light from the walls. The architecture was unlike anything Mark had ever seen before, elegant and organic, as if the building had grown naturally rather than been constructed. It was a stark contrast to the cold, utilitarian designs of Earth's military structures. Here there was a sense of harmony with the environment, a balance that spoke of a civilization far more advanced than anything Mark had encountered. As they walked, Mark noticed that the warriors surrounding him were all women, tall, athletic, and undeniably beautiful, with an otherworldly grace that made them seem almost ethereal. Their armor was form-fitting and covered in intricate patterns, each one unique yet part of a cohesive design. Their eyes, glowing softly in the dim light, flicked toward him every so often, curiosity evident in their gazes. It wasn't just the physical differences that set these women apart. There was something about their demeanor and air of confidence and purpose that suggested they were not just warriors, but leaders and protectors of their world. Mark felt a pang of unease as he realized the enormity of his situation. He was an outsider in a society that had not seen a man in centuries, and he had no idea how they would react to his presence. Finally, they reached the end of the corridor, where a set of double doors loomed before them. The leader turned to Mark, her expression serious. "Wait here," she instructed, before entering the room beyond the doors. Mark stood in the hallway, flanked by the other warriors, his mind racing. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the building's inner workings. He knew that whatever lay beyond those doors would determine his fate on this planet. After what felt like an eternity, the doors opened again, and the leader emerged. She gestured for Mark to follow her inside. The room beyond was vast, with high ceilings and walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to tell the story of an ancient and proud civilization. At the far end of the room, seated on a throne carved from a single piece of shimmering stone, was the most striking figure Mark had ever seen: Queen Zephyra. She was tall and regal, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Her hair, a cascade of silver, framed a face that was both ageless and wise, her eyes glowing with an intensity that made Mark's breath catch. She wore a gown of flowing, iridescent fabric that shifted colors with her every movement, and around her neck hung a pendant that pulsed with a soft, inner light. But it was not just her appearance that captivated Mark. There was an aura about her, a palpable energy that filled the room and made the air hum with power. This was a woman who had led her people through countless challenges, who had seen and done things that Mark could only imagine. And now she was looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite place. The leader stepped forward and bowed deeply before the queen. "Your Majesty, this is the human male we discovered near the wreckage of his ship. He claims to have crash-landed on our planet due to a malfunction." Zephyra's gaze never left Mark as she listened to the leader's report. When the woman had finished, the queen leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. So she said, her voice low and resonant, "You are the first man to set foot on our planet in over 500 years. Tell me, human, what do you know of our world?" Mark swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Very little, Your Majesty," he replied, his tone respectful. "I was on a reconnaissance mission for my fleet when my ship encountered a strange energy field. It malfunctioned, and I was forced to make an emergency landing. I had no knowledge of your planet or your people before I arrived." Zephyra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she rose from her throne, her gown flowing around her like water as she descended the steps to stand before him. Up close, Mark could see the subtle lines of age on her face. the marks of a life lived in the service of her people. "You are a long way from home, soldier," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been sympathy. "And yet, you find yourself in a place where your presence is both a miracle and a curse." Mark frowned slightly, unsure of how to respond. "I don't understand, Your Majesty." Zephyra smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Of course you don't. But you will." In time, she turned to the leader. "Ensure that our guest is treated with the utmost respect. He is not to be harmed or mistreated in any way. I will speak with him further once I have consulted with the council." The leader bowed again. "As you command, Your Majesty." With that, Zephyra turned and began to walk back to her throne, but not before casting one last glance at Mark. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken question, a curiosity that mirrored his own. As he was led out of the throne room and down another corridor, Mark couldn't help but feel that his life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. He had come to this planet by accident, but now, it seemed, fate had other plans for him. What those plans were, he could only guess. But one thing was certain: his journey on this strange, beautiful world was only just beginning. And he had no idea where it would lead him next. Mark awoke to the sound of soft chimes echoing through the room, a gentle but insistent melody that gradually pulled him from the depths of sleep. He blinked his eyes open, momentarily disoriented by his unfamiliar surroundings. The ceiling above him was high and domed, adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Soft light filtered through the translucent walls, casting a warm golden glow over everything. He sat up slowly, wincing as a dull ache radiated through his muscles. The events of the previous day came rushing back to him: the crash landing, the strange planet, the women who had taken him captive, and of course Queen Zephyra. He glanced around the room, taking in the elegant yet functional furnishings. The bed he had slept on was large and comfortable, covered in silky, iridescent fabric that shimmered with each movement. Nearby, a small table held a pitcher of water and a bowl of what appeared to be fruit, its vibrant colors and unfamiliar shapes catching his eye. The room was luxurious, far more so than he had expected given his status as a prisoner, or perhaps guest was a more accurate term, considering the Queen's instructions. The walls were smooth and seamless, without any visible joints or seams, giving the space an organic, almost otherworldly feel. A doorway on the far side of the room led to an adjoining chamber, where Mark could hear the faint trickle of running water. Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, testing his balance. The previous day's ordeal had left him battered but not broken, and he was grateful for the chance to rest and recover. He took a moment to stretch, easing the stiffness from his limbs before moving toward the table. He poured himself a glass of water and took a cautious sip, finding it cool and refreshing. The fruit, however, he decided to leave alone for now. There was no telling what it might do to his human digestive system. As he stood there, sipping the water and contemplating his next move, the door to the room slid open with a soft hiss. Mark tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm, before he remembered that it had been taken from him. He turned to face the doorway, half expecting to see a group of armed warriors ready to escort him to another interrogation. Instead, he was met with a far less intimidating sight. A young woman stood in the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was dressed in simple, flowing garments of soft blue fabric that contrasted with her dark, smooth skin. Her hair was braided into intricate patterns that framed her delicate features, and her eyes, large and luminous, regarded Mark with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. She was clearly different from the warriors he had encountered before, her demeanor gentle and unassuming. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but clear. The translation device clipped to her belt rendered her words into Mark's language with only a slight delay. "I hope you rested well." Mark nodded, setting the glass down on the table. "I did, thank you," he replied, trying to match her polite tone. "Where am I?" The young woman stepped further into the room, her movements graceful and precise. "You are in the guest quarters of the royal palace, near the capital city of Elysium. Queen Zephyra has instructed that you be treated with the utmost respect during your stay." Elysium, Mark repeated, the name rolling off his tongue. It sounded almost mythical, a fitting name for such a place. "And you are?" "My name is Lyria," the woman answered with a small smile. "I have been assigned as your attendant during your time here." If there is anything you need, please do not hesitate to ask. Mark studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her intentions. Lyria seemed genuine, her demeanor calm and respectful, but there was an undercurrent of tension in her posture, a subtle unease that made Mark wonder just how much she knew about him and his sudden arrival on the planet. "Thank you, Lyria," he said, deciding to take her at face value for now. "I appreciate your help, but I have to ask, why am I being treated like this? I'm a stranger here, and from what I understand, my presence is unprecedented." Lyria hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before she met his eyes again. "It is true that we have not had a visitor like you in many generations," she admitted. "The Queen believes that your arrival is of great significance, though not all share her view. There are those who are concerned about what your presence might mean for our society." Mark frowned, sensing the weight of her words. "Concerned? How so?" Lyria opened her mouth to respond but paused as another figure entered the room, one that Mark immediately recognized. It was the leader of the warrior contingent who had first captured him, the woman with the commanding presence and piercing eyes. She was dressed in her armor once again, though this time it was less ornate, more functional, as if she had just come from training or patrol. Her expression was unreadable as she approached, but Mark could see the tension in the lines of her face. "Lyria, you may leave us," the warrior said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I will speak with our guest." Lyria bowed her head respectfully and quickly exited the room, leaving Mark alone with the warrior. She studied him for a long moment before speaking, her eyes never leaving his. "My name is Seraphis," she said finally, her voice as sharp and precise as her movements. "I am the commander of the Queen's Guard, tasked with protecting Her Majesty and enforcing her will. And right now her will is that you are treated as an honored guest, though I cannot say I agree with that decision." Mark crossed his arms over his chest, meeting her gaze evenly. "You don't trust me." Seraphis's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You are perceptive, human." "No, I do not trust you. Your arrival here is an anomaly, one that could disrupt the delicate balance of our society. It is my duty to ensure that does not happen." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Mark said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just trying to survive until I can find a way to get back home." "Home," Seraphis repeated, her expression hardening. "You will find that returning to your home may not be as simple as you believe." Mark felt a chill run down his spine at her words. "What do you mean?" Seraphis did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned and walked over to one of the windows, gazing out at the sprawling city below. Mark followed her, taking in the view. The city of Elysium was a breathtaking sight, with its elegant spires and flowing architecture that seemed to merge seamlessly with the natural landscape. The streets below bustled with activity, though the people moved with a grace and poise that spoke of a society built on discipline and order. "Our planet, EOS," Seraphis began, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness, "is a place of great beauty and power. But it is also a place of great sorrow. Long ago, our world was torn apart by war between men and women that nearly destroyed us all. The decision was made to separate the sexes, to create a society where only women would rule, where we could rebuild and thrive without the chaos that men brought with them." Mark listened in stunned silence as Seraphis spoke, her words painting a picture of a world that had been shaped by conflict and division. It was a story unlike anything he had ever heard, a tale of a society that had chosen to isolate itself in the name of survival. "We have lived in peace for centuries," Seraphis continued, "but the scars of that war run deep. The very idea of a man on EOS is a threat to everything we have built. And now you are here, a living reminder of the past we have tried so hard to forget." Mark swallowed hard, struggling to process what he was hearing. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to disrupt your society. I just want to understand what happened and find a way to fix my ship so I can leave." Seraphis turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "There is more at stake here than you realize, human. Your presence has already caused a ripple in our society, one that could grow into a wave if we are not careful. The Queen may see you as a symbol of change, but not everyone agrees with her. There are those who would see you gone by any means necessary." Mark felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" For the first time, Seraphis's gaze softened, and she sighed. "I want what is best for my people. I will protect them, no matter the cost. But I also serve the Queen, and she has chosen to spare you, to see what potential you might have. For now, I will abide by her decision." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. He was walking a fine line, and any misstep could have dire consequences. He would have to tread carefully, navigating the complex web of politics and emotions that surrounded him. "Thank you for being honest with me," he said finally. "I appreciate it." Seraphis inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Do not mistake my honesty for friendship, human. I am watching you closely. If you give me any reason to believe you are a threat to EOS, I will not hesitate to act." With that, she turned and left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He stood by the window for a long time, gazing out at the city below as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The light of dawn bathed Elysium in a soft, golden glow, highlighting the beauty of the world he had inadvertently become a part of. But beneath that beauty, Mark could sense the tension, the fear of the unknown that his presence had awakened. He knew now that his stay on EOS would not be a simple one. There were forces at play that he barely understood, and his every move would be scrutinized by those who saw him as a potential threat. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the curiosity that burned within him, the desire to understand this world, its people, and the reasons behind their isolation. With a deep breath, Mark turned away from the window and made his way to the adjoining chamber. The sound of running water grew louder as he entered the room, which turned out to be a luxurious bathhouse, its walls lined with smooth, polished stone. A large pool of crystal clear water lay in the center, steam rising from its surface. He stripped off his clothes and stepped into the water, sighing as the warmth enveloped him. The tension in his muscles began to melt away, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to relax, to forget about the challenges that lay ahead. But even as he sank deeper into the water, his mind raced with questions. What had really happened on this planet all those centuries ago? What had driven the men and women to such extremes that they chose to live apart? And what role did Queen Zephyra see him playing in the future of her people? Mark knew that finding the answers to those questions would not be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't leave EOS until he understood the truth. His survival and perhaps the future of this world depended on it. Later that day, Mark was escorted by Lyria through the winding corridors of the palace. The halls were alive with activity as members of the royal court and various officials moved about, attending to their duties. Mark noticed that nearly everyone he encountered was a woman, their clothing and demeanor reflecting their roles within the society. Some wore the ornate garb of nobles, others the practical attire of scholars and artisans. All of them, however, gave Mark curious glances as he passed, their eyes lingering on him with a mix of intrigue and caution. Lyria led him to a spacious chamber filled with artifacts and ancient scrolls. The room had the feel of a library, though it was unlike any library Mark had seen before. Instead of shelves lined with books, the walls were adorned with holographic displays that projected images and texts into the air. Intricate carvings covered the stone pillars that supported the ceiling, depicting scenes of battles, rituals, and the daily life of the people of EOS. "This is the Hall of Records," Lyria explained as they entered. "It is here that we keep the history of our people, from the earliest days of our civilization to the present. Queen Zephyra has granted you access to these records, so that you may learn about our world and understand the context in which you now find yourself." Mark glanced around the room, feeling a mixture of awe and apprehension. Why would she do that? Why give me access to your history? Lyria hesitated for a moment before replying. "The Queen believes that knowledge is the key to understanding. She wishes for you to see our world as it is, to understand the choices that were made and the consequences that followed. Perhaps by learning our history, you will find a way to coexist with us, or, if it is your wish, to return to your own world." Mark nodded slowly, appreciating the gesture. It was clear that Queen Zephyra was willing to take a risk by allowing him to access this knowledge, a risk that not everyone in her court would agree with. But it also showed that she saw something in him, something worth exploring. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll make the most of this opportunity." Lyria smiled faintly and gestured to one of the displays. "If you need anything, I will be nearby. Simply call for me." With that, she left him alone in the Hall of Records, the door sliding shut behind her. Mark approached the nearest display and hesitated for a moment before reaching out to touch it. The holographic interface responded immediately, expanding to show a series of options. He selected a file labeled The Great Divide and watched as the display shifted, revealing an intricate tapestry of images and text. As he began to read, the story of EOS unfolded before him, a story of a once unified society torn apart by conflict, of a war that had pitted men against women in a brutal struggle for power. The details were both fascinating and horrifying, revealing the depths of human, or rather, alien nature when pushed to the brink. The war had been sparked by a series of escalating tensions, driven by greed, fear, and the desire for control. The men of EOS, once equal partners with the women in governance and society, had begun to push for greater dominance, believing that their physical strength entitled them to rule. The women, however, were not willing to relinquish their hard-won rights and independence, leading to a bitter struggle that eventually consumed the entire planet. The records describe the horrors of the conflict in vivid detail: the battles, the betrayals, the devastation that had ravaged the land. But what struck Mark the most was the deep sense of loss that permeated the accounts. This was not just a war for power. It was a war that had torn apart families, friendships, and communities. The scars it left behind were still felt centuries later, in the very fabric of the society that had emerged from the ashes. In the aftermath of the war, the decision had been made to separate the sexes, to create two distinct societies that would never again come into conflict. The women had taken control of EOS, establishing a matriarchal society that emphasized peace, cooperation, and the protection of their world from external threats. The men, on the other hand, had been exiled to distant lands or had left the planet entirely, their fates unknown. Mark found himself lost in the stories, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was reading. This was a world that had been shaped by pain and suffering, by choices made in desperation and fear. It was no wonder that his presence was seen as a threat, a reminder of a past that the people of EOS had tried so hard to bury. But as he continued to read, Mark also began to see glimpses of hope, of a society that had found a way to thrive, despite its tragic history. The women of EOS had built something remarkable, a civilization that valued harmony and balance, that sought to protect and nurture its people. It was a society that had much to teach him, if he was willing to learn. Hours passed as Mark delved deeper into the records, absorbing everything he could about EOS and its people. He learned about their customs, their beliefs, and the technological advancements that had allowed them to rebuild and prosper. He studied the structure of their government, the role of the queen, and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined their political landscape. Mark listened in stunned silence as Seraphis spoke, her words painting a picture of a world that had been shaped by conflict and division. It was a story unlike anything he had ever heard, a tale of a society that had chosen to isolate itself in the name of survival. "We have lived in peace for centuries," Seraphis continued, "but the scars of that war run deep. The very idea of a man on EOS is a threat to everything we have built. And now you are here, a living reminder of the past we have tried so hard to forget." Mark swallowed hard, struggling to process what he was hearing. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to disrupt your society. I just want to understand what happened and find a way to fix my ship so I can leave." Seraphis turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "There is more at stake here than you realize, human. Your presence has already caused a ripple in our society, one that could grow into a wave if we are not careful. The Queen may see you as a symbol of change, but not everyone agrees with her. There are those who would see you gone by any means necessary." Mark felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" For the first time, Seraphis's gaze softened, and she sighed. "I want what is best for my people. I will protect them, no matter the cost. But I also serve the Queen, and she has chosen to spare you, to see what potential you might have. For now, I will abide by her decision." Mark nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. He was walking a fine line, and any misstep could have dire consequences. He would have to tread carefully, navigating the complex web of politics and emotions that surrounded him. "Thank you for being honest with me," he said finally. "I appreciate it." Seraphis inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Do not mistake my honesty for friendship, human. I am watching you closely. If you give me any reason to believe you are a threat to EOS, I will not hesitate to act." With that, She turned and left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He stood by the window for a long time, gazing out at the city below as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The light of dawn bathed Elysium in a soft, golden glow, highlighting the beauty of the world he had inadvertently become a part of. But beneath that beauty, Mark could sense the tension, the fear of the unknown that his presence had awakened. He knew now that his stay on EOS would not be a simple one. There were forces at play that he barely understood, and his every move would be scrutinized by those who saw him as a potential threat. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the curiosity that burned within him, the desire to understand this world, its people, and the reasons behind their isolation. With a deep breath, Mark turned away from the window and made his way to the adjoining chamber. The sound of running water grew louder as he entered the room, which turned out to be a luxurious bathhouse, its walls lined with smooth, polished stone. A large pool of crystal clear water lay in the center, steam rising from its surface. He stripped off his clothes and stepped into the water, sighing as the warmth enveloped him. The tension in his muscles began to melt away, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to relax, to forget about the challenges that lay ahead. But even as he sank deeper into the water, his mind raced with questions. What had really happened on this planet all those centuries ago? What had driven the men and women to such extremes that they chose to live apart? And what role did Queen Zephyra see him playing in the future of her people? Mark knew that finding the answers to those questions would not be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't leave EOS until he understood the truth. His survival and perhaps the future of this world depended on it. Later that day, Mark was escorted by Lyria through the winding corridors of the palace. The halls were alive with activity as members of the royal court and various officials moved about, attending to their duties. Mark noticed that nearly everyone he encountered was a woman, their clothing and demeanor reflecting their roles within the society. Some wore the ornate garb of nobles, others the practical attire of scholars and artisans. All of them, however, gave Mark curious glances as he passed, their eyes lingering on him with a mix of intrigue and caution. Lyria led him to a spacious chamber filled with artifacts and ancient scrolls. The room had the feel of a library, though it was unlike any library Mark had seen before. Instead of shelves lined with books, the walls were adorned with holographic displays that projected images and texts into the air. Intricate carvings covered the stone pillars that supported the ceiling, depicting scenes of battles, rituals, and the daily life of the people of EOS. "This is the Hall of Records," Lyria explained as they entered. "It is here that we keep the history of our people, from the earliest days of our civilization to the present. Queen Zephyra has granted you access to these records, so that you may learn about our world and understand the context in which you now find yourself." Mark glanced around the room, feeling a mixture of awe and apprehension. Why would she do that? Why give me access to your history? Lyria hesitated for a moment before replying. "The Queen believes that knowledge is the key to understanding. She wishes for you to see our world as it is, to understand the choices that were made and the consequences that followed. Perhaps by learning our history, you will find a way to coexist with us, or, if it is your wish, to return to your own world." Mark nodded slowly, appreciating the gesture. It was clear that Queen Zephyra was willing to take a risk by allowing him to access this knowledge, a risk that not everyone in her court would agree with. But it also showed that she saw something in him, something worth exploring. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll make the most of this opportunity." Lyria smiled faintly and gestured to one of the displays. "If you need anything, I will be nearby. Simply call for me." With that, she left him alone in the Hall of Records, the door sliding shut behind her. Mark approached the nearest display and hesitated for a moment before reaching out to touch it. The holographic interface responded immediately, expanding to show a series of options. He selected a file labeled "The Great Divide" and watched as the display shifted, revealing an intricate tapestry of images and text. As he began to read, the story of EOS unfolded before him, a story of a once unified society torn apart by conflict, of a war that had pitted men against women in a brutal struggle for power. The details were both fascinating and horrifying, revealing the depths of human, or rather, alien nature when pushed to the brink. The war had been sparked by a series of escalating tensions, driven by greed, fear, and the desire for control. The men of EOS, once equal partners with the women in governance and society, had begun to push for greater dominance, believing that their physical strength entitled them to rule. The women, however, were not willing to relinquish their hard-won rights and independence, leading to a bitter struggle that eventually consumed the entire planet. The records describe the horrors of the conflict in vivid detail: the battles, the betrayals, the devastation that had ravaged the land. But what struck Mark the most was the deep sense of loss that permeated the accounts. This was not just a war for power. It was a war that had torn apart families, friendships, and communities. The scars it left behind were still felt centuries later, in the very fabric of the society that had emerged from the ashes. In the aftermath of the war, the decision had been made to separate the sexes, to create two distinct societies that would never again come into conflict. The women had taken control of EOS, establishing a matriarchal society that emphasized peace, cooperation, and the protection of their world from external threats. The men, on the other hand, had been exiled to distant lands or had left the planet entirely, their fates unknown. Mark found himself lost in the stories, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was reading. This was a world that had been shaped by pain and suffering, by choices made in desperation and fear. It was no wonder that his presence was seen as a threat, a reminder of a past that the people of EOS had tried so hard to bury. But as he continued to read, Mark also began to see glimpses of hope, of a society that had found a way to thrive, despite its tragic history. The women of EOS had built something remarkable, a civilization that valued harmony and balance, that sought to protect and nurture its people. It was a society that had much to teach him, if he was willing to learn. Hours passed as Mark delved deeper into the records, absorbing everything he could about EOS and its people. He learned about their customs, their beliefs, and the technological advancements that had allowed them to rebuild and prosper. He studied the structure of their government, the role of the queen, and the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined their political landscape. But the more he learned, the more questions arose in his mind. What had happened to the men who had left EOS? Were they still out there, somewhere in the galaxy? And what did Queen Zephyra truly hope to achieve by allowing him to stay on her planet? As the day wore on, Mark finally stepped away from the display, his mind buzzing with information. He knew that he had only scratched the surface of the mysteries that surrounded EOS, but he also knew that he had made progress. He was beginning to understand the context in which he now found himself, the reasons behind the caution and suspicion that greeted him at every turn. But there was still so much he didn't know, so much that he needed to learn if he was to find a way forward. With a sigh, Mark left the Hall of Records and made his way back to his quarters. The palace was quieter now, the activity of the day winding down as evening approached. He passed by several members of the royal court, each one giving him a polite nod or a curious glance, but none stopped to speak with him. When he finally reached his room, he found Lyria waiting for him, a small tray of food in her hands. She smiled as he entered, setting the tray down on the table. "I thought you might be hungry after spending so much time in the Hall of Records," she said warmly. "I hope the information was helpful." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward the young woman. It was. "Thank you, Lyria. I learned a lot, but I still have so many questions." Lyria's smile faltered slightly, and she lowered her gaze. "I understand. This world can be difficult to comprehend, especially for someone who has never known anything like it. But I believe that with time, you will find the answers you seek." Mark appreciated her kindness, but he could sense the underlying tension in her words. There were things she wasn't telling him, things that he would have to discover on his own. He sat down at the table and began to eat, the food surprisingly delicious despite its unfamiliar appearance. Lyria remained nearby, her presence a quiet comfort as Mark processed everything he had learned. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself thinking once again about Queen Zephyra. She was a formidable leader, but there was something else about her, something that intrigued him, that drew him to her in a way he couldn't quite explain. He wondered what she was thinking, what plans she had for him, and whether she truly believed that his presence could change the course of her society. The answers to those questions would come in time, he knew, but for now Mark could only wait and prepare himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. As night fell over the palace, Mark lay in bed, staring up at the shifting patterns on the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of EOS, of the people he had met, and of the uncertain future that awaited him. He was a stranger in a strange land, caught between two worlds with no clear path forward. But one thing was certain: he could not afford to make any mistakes. The stakes were too high, and the consequences too severe. With that thought in mind, Mark closed his eyes and let the weariness of the day overtake him, his dreams filled with visions of a world on the brink of change, a world where his presence could make all the difference. The next morning, Mark was once again awakened by the soft chimes that signaled the start of a new day. He rose quickly, his mind already focused on the tasks ahead. Today he would continue his exploration of EOS, seeking out more answers to the questions that plagued him. Lyria arrived shortly after, her usual smile in place, as she greeted him. "Good morning, Mark. I trust you slept well." "I did," he replied, feeling a sense of purpose as he prepared for the day. "What's on the agenda today?" Lyria hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the door before returning to Mark. "Queen Zephyra has requested your presence in the gardens. She wishes to speak with you further." Mark's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the Queen. He had been wondering when she would summon him again, and now that the moment had arrived, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Lead the way," he said, nodding to Lyria. The young woman guided him through the palace, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty halls. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the polished floors. Mark could feel the weight of the palace's history pressing down on him, the echoes of the past lingering in every corner. Finally, they reached the entrance to the gardens, a set of ornate doors that opened onto a sprawling expanse of greenery. The air was fresh and filled with the scent of flowers, the sounds of birds and insects creating a peaceful, almost otherworldly atmosphere. Queen Zephyra stood at the center of the garden, her back to him as she gazed out over a small pond. She was dressed in a simple gown of pale green, her silver hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of moonlight. The sight of her took Mark's breath away, and for a moment he hesitated, unsure of how to approach her. But then she turned, her eyes meeting his with a calm, knowing gaze. "Mark," she said softly, her voice carrying across the garden. "Thank you for joining me." Mark nodded, stepping forward to join her by the pond. "Your Majesty," he greeted her, his voice respectful. Zephyra smiled faintly, her gaze returning to the water. "Please, there is no need for formalities here. We are simply two individuals seeking to understand each other." Mark relaxed slightly at her words, though he remained cautious. "You wish to speak with me?" "Yes," she replied, her tone thoughtful. "I understand that you spent much of yesterday in the Hall of Records. What did you learn?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But he knew that honesty was his best option, especially with someone as perceptive as Zephyra. "I learned about the history of EOS," he said slowly. "About the war, the separation of the sexes, and the society that emerged from that conflict. I also learned that my presence here is complicated." Zephyra nodded, her expression somber. "Indeed, EOS is a world born from pain and loss, and our people have worked hard to build a society that values peace and harmony. But your arrival has stirred something within us, memories of the past that we have tried to bury." Mark frowned, sensing the depth of her words. "Is that why you allowed me to stay? Because you believe my presence could bring about change?" Zephyra was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. "Perhaps," she said finally. "But it is not just change that I seek. It is understanding. You are an outsider, Mark, and yet you carry with you the potential to bridge the divide that has separated our people for so long. I believe that by learning from each other, we can find a way forward, a way to heal the wounds of the past and create a future where men and women can coexist once again." Mark felt a surge of emotion at her words, a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to help," he said quietly. "If there's anything I can do to make that future a reality, I will." Zephyra turned to face him fully, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I believe you, Mark, but there are many who do not share my vision. They see you as a threat, a symbol of everything they fear. It will not be easy to change their minds." "I understand," Mark replied, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to try, whatever it takes." Zephyra smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I am glad to hear that. For now I ask only that you continue to learn, to explore our world and see it for what it truly is. The time will come when you will need to make a choice that will determine the fate of EOS." Mark nodded, his resolve solidifying. "I'll do whatever I can to help, Your Majesty." "Thank you," Mark, Zephyra said softly, her gaze holding his for a long moment. Then she turned back to the pond, her expression thoughtful. "There is much work to be done, but I believe that together we can achieve something truly remarkable." As they stood there in the peaceful garden, the future of EOS stretched out before them, a future filled with uncertainty, challenges, and the potential for profound change. Mark knew that his journey was only just beginning, and that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and difficult decisions. But he also knew that he had found a purpose, a reason to fight not just for his own survival, but for the chance to build a better world. And as long as Queen Zephyra stood by his side, he knew that anything was possible. The days following Mark's conversation with Queen Zephyra were marked by a subtle yet undeniable shift in the atmosphere of the palace. Where once there had been an undercurrent of curiosity mixed with caution, there was now a palpable tension that seemed to ripple through the halls like a gathering storm. Mark could feel it in the way the guards watched him more closely, in the whispered conversations that abruptly ceased when he entered a room, and in the furtive glances exchanged by the courtiers who passed him in the corridors. Elysium, the heart of the planet EOS, was a city that thrived on order and discipline. Its society was built on a delicate balance of tradition and progress, and the sudden introduction of an outsider, a man, no less, had upset that balance in ways that were only beginning to manifest. Mark could sense the unease growing around him, a low hum of discontent that threatened to escalate into something far more dangerous. As he walked the palace grounds, exploring the gardens, the libraries, and the many chambers filled with the artifacts of EOS's long history, Mark could not shake the feeling that he was being watched, monitored not just by the guards, but by the very walls themselves. The palace was a place of ancient secrets, its foundations built on the memories of a world torn apart by war and rebuilt on the ashes of the past. And now, it seemed, those old wounds were being reopened. The Queen, too, had become more distant in the days since their conversation in the gardens, though she continued to grant him access to the Hall of Records and allowed him to move freely within the palace. Their interactions had grown more formal, more guarded. Zephyra seemed preoccupied, her thoughts elsewhere, and Mark couldn't help but wonder if the burden of leadership was weighing heavily on her, if she was struggling with the consequences of her decision to let him stay. One morning, as Mark stood in the palace courtyard watching the sun rise over the city, Lyria approached him with an expression that was both anxious and apologetic. She had become a familiar presence during his time in the palace, her gentle demeanor and quiet competence a source of comfort amidst the growing tension. "Mark," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper, "there is something you should know." Mark turned to face her, his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, Lyria?" She glanced around nervously, as if afraid they might be overheard, before leaning in closer. "There are those within the court who believe that your presence here is dangerous, who think that the Queen is making a grave mistake by allowing you to remain." Mark's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone he trusted made the reality all the more daunting. Who are these people, and what do they plan to do? Lyria bit her lip, her eyes filled with worry. "The opposition is led by General Kyra, a powerful and influential member of the military council. She is a respected leader, known for her strength and loyalty to the Queen. But she also holds to the old ways, to the belief that men are a threat to our society." Mark's pulse quickened at the mention of General Kyra. He had heard her name whispered in the corridors, spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration. She was a figure of authority, a warrior who commanded the respect of the soldiers and the fear of her enemies. If she had set her sights on him, Mark knew he was in serious trouble. "What does she want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lyria hesitated before answering. "She wants you gone, Mark. She believes that your presence could undo everything our society has worked to achieve. And she's not alone. There are others who share her views, who fear the changes you represent. They are pressuring the Queen to reconsider her decision, to send you away before it's too late." Mark felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. And what does Queen Zephyra think? Lyria's expression softened, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "The Queen is torn, Mark. She believes in the possibility of change, in the hope that you could help bridge the divide between our people. But she also knows that her position is precarious, that the support of the council and the military is crucial to maintaining her rule. If she loses that support, it could lead to—" She trailed off, but Mark didn't need her to finish the sentence. He understood all too well what was at stake. The Queen's authority was not absolute, it was held together by a fragile alliance of trust and loyalty, one that could be shattered if her decisions were perceived as too risky, too radical. "Is there anything I can do?" Mark asked, feeling a growing sense of helplessness. "Anything to convince them that I'm not a threat?" Lyria shook her head slowly. "I don't know, Mark. The situation is more complicated than it seems. General Kyra and her followers are not easily swayed, and the fear of the unknown is a powerful force. But perhaps if you continue to learn about our world, to show them that you are here to help and not to harm, it might make a difference." Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He had seen firsthand how fear and suspicion could drive people to extreme measures, how the seeds of doubt could grow into a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. He needed to tread carefully, to find a way to navigate the treacherous waters of Eos's political landscape without making things worse. "Thank you, Lyria," he said quietly. "I appreciate you telling me this." She smiled faintly, though the worry never left her eyes. "Be careful, Mark. The palace is a place of many secrets, and not all of them are benign. There are forces at work here that even the Queen cannot fully control." With that ominous warning, Lyria excused herself and left Mark alone in the courtyard, her footsteps fading into the distance. Mark stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise higher into the sky, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had just learned. He had always known that his presence on EOS would be controversial, that there would be those who saw him as a threat to their way of life. But the reality of the situation was even more complex and dangerous than he had anticipated. General Kyra was a formidable opponent, one who wielded significant power and influence. If she truly believed that he was a danger to EOS, then his very life could be at risk. Mark knew that he needed to take action, but he wasn't sure where to start. He had already spent hours in the Hall of Records, learning everything he could about the history and culture of EOS. He had tried to keep a low profile, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to himself, but it seemed that his very existence was enough to spark unrest. As he stood there, lost in thought, a sudden movement caught his eye. He turned to see a figure approaching him, tall, clad in armor, with a presence that exuded authority and strength. It was General Kyra herself. Mark's heart skipped a beat as she drew nearer, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She was an imposing figure, her dark hair pulled back into a tight braid, her features sharp and angular. Her armor, though functional, was adorned with intricate designs that marked her as a warrior of great renown. "Mark Danner," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as steel. "I have been looking for you." Mark forced himself to remain calm, meeting her gaze without flinching. "General Kyra, I've heard a lot about you." Her lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "I'm sure you have. The Queen speaks highly of you, but I am not so easily convinced." Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble, General. I'm just trying to understand your world and find a way to help." Kyra's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Help? You believe you can help us? A man, from a world that knows nothing of our history, our struggles?" Mark took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know I'm an outsider, and I know that I can't fully understand what your people have been through. But I also know that there's value in trying to bridge the gap, in learning from each other instead of fearing each other." Kyra's gaze was piercing, as if she were trying to see into the depths of his soul. For a moment she said nothing, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Then, finally she spoke, her tone measured but still laced with suspicion. "Tell me, Mark Danner, what do you truly seek here? Is it knowledge, power, or perhaps something more personal?" Mark's heart raced as he realized the implication of her words. She was probing, searching for a weakness, a motive that she could exploit. He needed to be honest, but he also needed to protect himself from whatever trap she might be setting. "I seek understanding," he said carefully. "I want to learn about your world, to understand why things are the way they are. I believe that by doing so, I can find a way to coexist peacefully with your people." Kyra's expression remained inscrutable, her eyes flicking over him, as if assessing his every word, his every gesture. "And what of the Queen? What are your intentions toward her?" Mark's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected the question, and the intensity with which she asked it sent a chill through him. He knew that any hint of an inappropriate relationship with Zephyra would be dangerous, not just for him but for the Queen as well. My relationship with the Queen is one of mutual respect, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. I admire her leadership, her strength, and her vision for the future. But I am here as a guest, nothing more. Kyra's gaze bore into him, as if searching for any sign of deceit. After a long, tense moment, she finally nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Very well, she said. But know this, Mark Danner, I am watching you. If you make one misstep, if you do anything to endanger our society or our Queen, the First will not hesitate to act. Do you understand? Mark nodded, the weight of her warning heavy on his shoulders. I understand, General. Without another word, Kyra turned and strode away, her presence leaving a palpable void in her wake. Mark watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just come face to face with one of the most powerful figures on EOS, and he knew that the encounter had been a test of his intentions, of his resolve. He had passed for now, but the stakes had just been raised. Kyra was not someone to be taken lightly, and her influence within the military and the council meant that she could turn the tide against him at any moment. As he stood there, processing the encounter, he felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over him. The tension, the uncertainty, the constant need to be on guard, it was taking its toll. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now, not when everything hung in the balance. Mark knew that he needed to find allies, to build support among those who believed in the possibility of change. But who could he trust? Lyria was kind and loyal, but she was not a decision-maker. Sapphira was powerful, but even she was not immune to the pressures of the council and the military. He would need to tread carefully, to navigate the intricate web of politics and alliances that defined life on EOS, and he would need to do so quickly, before Kyra and her followers could gather enough support to force the Queen's hand. With a deep breath, Mark made his way back to the Hall of Records. There was still so much to learn, so much that he didn't understand about this world and its people, but he was determined to find the answers, to uncover the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. As he entered the chamber, the familiar glow of the holographic displays greeted him, the ancient texts and images flickering in the air like ghosts of the past. Mark approached one of the displays and activated it, immersing himself once again in the history of EOS. The records told the story of a world that had risen from the ashes of war, a society that had chosen to rebuild itself by embracing unity and cooperation. But they also hinted at the darker side of that history, the fear, the mistrust, the decisions made out of desperation and necessity. As Mark read, he began to see the patterns, the threads that connected the past to the present. The war between men and women had left deep scars on EOS, scars that had never fully healed. The decision to separate the sexes had been a drastic measure, one that had been necessary to ensure the survival of the society, but it had also created a rift, a division that had shaped the very fabric of their world. Now, with his arrival, that rift was being exposed once again. Mark realized that he was not just an outsider, he was a catalyst, a force that could either heal the wounds of the past or reopen them. He needed to be careful, to choose his actions wisely. The future of EOS and perhaps even his own life depended on it. Hours passed as Mark pored over the records, his mind absorbing the information with a mixture of fascination and dread. He learned about the early days of the war, the events that had led to the decision to separate the sexes, and the long years of rebuilding that had followed. He read about the creation of the Queen's Guard, the establishment of the military council, and the rise of leaders like General Kyra, figures who had shaped the course of EOS's history and ensured the stability of their society. But he also found hints of dissent, of voices that had questioned the wisdom of the separation. There were records of debates within the council, of leaders who had argued for a different path, one that would allow for reconciliation and cooperation between men and women. These voices had been silenced, their ideas dismissed as too dangerous, too radical. Mark wondered what had become of those dissenters, whether their ideas had been lost to history or if they still lingered in the minds of some. He knew that if there were any hope of bridging the divide, of finding a way to coexist, he would need to find those who shared his vision. But time was running out. The opposition was growing stronger, and the pressure on Queen Sapphira was mounting. Mark knew that he needed to act, to find a way to prove that his presence was not a threat but an opportunity. As he left the Hall of Records, his mind racing with possibilities, he knew that the next few days would be critical. The decisions he made, the alliances he forged, would determine the course of his future and the future of EOS. He just hoped that he would have the strength and the wisdom to make the right choices. The next day, Mark was summoned to a meeting in the Queen's private chambers. The summons had come unexpectedly, delivered by one of the Queen's attendants with little explanation. Mark had spent the morning preparing himself, going over everything he had learned and trying to anticipate what the Queen might ask of him. When he arrived at the entrance to her chambers, he was greeted by Seraphis, the commander of the Queen's Guard. She gave him a curt nod, her expression as stoic as ever, before leading him inside. The Queen's chambers were as opulent as he remembered, filled with the soft glow of natural light and the scent of blooming flowers. Zephyra was seated near a large window that overlooked the gardens, her back straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a gown of deep violet, the color contrasting beautifully with her silver hair, which cascaded down her shoulders in loose waves. Mark, she greeted him, her voice warm but tinged with weariness. "Thank you for coming." Mark bowed his head respectfully as he approached. "Your Majesty." Zephyra gestured to a chair across from her. "Please sit." He did as she asked, trying to read her expression. She seemed troubled, her usually serene demeanor clouded by something that weighed heavily on her mind. "I have been thinking a great deal about our conversation in the garden," she began, her gaze fixed on the view outside the window. "About the future of EOS and the role you might play in it." Mark nodded, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. "I've been thinking about it too, Your Majesty. I want to help in any way I can." Zephyra's eyes met his, her expression softening slightly. "I believe you, Mark. But there are those who do not. The opposition to your presence here is growing stronger, and I fear that if something is not done soon, it could lead to a crisis that will tear our society apart." Mark felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his arrival had sparked the unrest. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I never wanted to cause any harm." Zephyra shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You are not to blame, Mark. The seeds of this conflict were sown long before you arrived. Your presence has merely brought them to the surface." She paused for a moment, her gaze distant, before continuing. "I have called you here because I need your help, Mark. There is a council meeting tonight, one that will determine the course of our future. General Kyra and her followers will be there, and they will argue for your removal from EOS. I need you to be there as well, to speak on your own behalf." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The idea of standing before the council, of facing Kyra and the others who opposed him, was daunting. But he knew that this was his chance, perhaps his only chance to make a difference. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "I'll speak to the council." Zephyra smiled, though the worry never left her eyes. "Thank you, Mark. I know this is not an easy task, but I believe in you. You have a strength that comes not from physical power, but from your heart, from your desire to understand and to bridge the divide between our people." Mark felt a warmth in his chest at her words, a sense of resolve that steeled him for the challenge ahead. "I won't let you down, Your Majesty." Zephyra nodded, her expression turning serious. "I will stand by you, Mark, but know that this will not be easy. The council is a place of debate and scrutiny, and General Kyra is a formidable opponent. You will need to be prepared for anything." Mark took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was to come. "I understand. I'm ready." The Queen rose from her seat and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but reassuring. "Then let us prepare. The future of EOS depends on it." The council chamber was a grand hall, its walls lined with banners representing the various regions of EOS. The ceiling was high and vaulted, supported by massive columns carved with intricate designs that depicted the history and achievements of the planet's civilization. At the far end of the chamber stood a raised platform, where the Queen's throne was positioned, flanked by the seats of the council members. As Mark entered the chamber, escorted by Seraphis, he could feel the weight of the room's history pressing down on him. The council members were already seated, their expressions ranging from curious to wary as they watched him approach. General Kyra was among them, her gaze cold and unyielding as she locked eyes with him. Queen Zephyra was seated on her throne, her posture regal and composed, though Mark could sense the tension in her demeanor. She gave him a slight nod as he approached, a gesture of encouragement that bolstered his resolve. Council member Zephyra began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. "We are gathered here tonight to discuss a matter of great importance, the presence of Mark Danner, a man from another world, in our society." There was a murmur of agreement from the council members, their eyes shifting from the Queen to Mark and back again. Zephyra continued, her tone measured and authoritative. Mark has come to us under extraordinary circumstances, and his presence has raised many questions that deserve to be addressed openly and honestly. I have invited Mark to speak before the council, to share his perspective and to answer any concerns you may have. She turned to Mark, her gaze steady. Mark, please step forward. Mark took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the council members on him, their scrutiny intense and unrelenting. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the moment that would determine his fate. He began by introducing himself, explaining how he had come to EOS and the circumstances of his crash landing. He spoke of his desire to learn about their world, to understand their history and culture, and to find a way to coexist peacefully. I know that my presence here is unprecedented, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves that churned within him. I understand that it may be seen as a threat to the way of life you have built, but I believe that there is value in trying to bridge the gap between us, in learning from each other and finding common ground. As he spoke, he could see the council members listening intently, their expressions thoughtful but guarded. He knew that words alone would not be enough to convince them. He needed to show them that he was sincere, that he truly meant what he said. I am not here to impose my beliefs or my way of life on your society, he continued. I am here to learn, to understand, and to contribute in whatever way I can. I believe that by working together, we can create a future where men and women can coexist in harmony, where the mistakes of the past do not define our future. There was a moment of silence after he finished speaking, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, one of the council members, a woman with silver hair and a stern expression, stood up. Mark Danner, she said, her voice cool and measured, you speak of peace and cooperation, but how can we trust your words? How do we know that your presence here will not bring about the same conflicts that tore our world apart centuries ago? Mark met her gaze, understanding the fear and doubt that lay behind her question. I understand your concerns, he replied. And I can't deny the history of conflict that exists between men and women on EOS. But I believe that we can learn from that history, that we can choose a different path. I am willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I am here in good faith, that I want to be a part of the solution, not the problem. The council member considered his words for a moment before nodding slightly and sitting down. But before Mark could feel any sense of relief, General Kyra rose from her seat, her expression hard as stone. Your words are noble, Mark Danner, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, but words are not enough. You are an outsider, a man from a world that knows nothing of our struggles, our sacrifices. How can we trust that you truly understand the gravity of what you are asking? Mark felt the intensity of her gaze, the challenge in her words. He knew that this was the crux of the matter, the question of trust, of whether he could truly be accepted into their society. I know that trust is not something that can be given lightly, he said, his voice calm but firm. It must be earned, and I am willing to earn it, General Kyra. I am willing to prove that I can be a valuable ally to EOS, that I can contribute to the betterment of your society. Kyra's eyes narrowed, her skepticism evident. And how do you propose to do that, Mark Danner? How do you intend to earn our trust? Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing for an answer. He knew that he needed to offer something concrete, something that would demonstrate his commitment to their world. I propose that I work alongside your people, he said, his voice resolute. That I participate in the daily life of EOS, that I contribute my skills and knowledge to your society. Let me learn from you, and in turn, let me share what I know. Together we can build a foundation of trust, step by step. There was a murmur of discussion among the council members, their eyes flicking between Mark and Kyra. The general remained silent for a moment, her gaze locked onto his, as if weighing his every word, his every intention. Finally she spoke, her voice slow and deliberate. Very well, Mark Danner. I will accept your proposal, but know this: you will be closely monitored, and any misstep will be met with swift consequences. Do you understand? Mark nodded, his resolve unwavering. I understand, General, and I accept your terms. There was a tense silence in the chamber as the council members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and cautious optimism. Then, finally, Queen Zephyra spoke, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Let it be known that Mark Danner will be allowed to remain on EOS," she declared, her gaze sweeping over the council. "He will work alongside our people, under the watchful eye of General Kyra, to prove his commitment to our society. This decision is made in the spirit of cooperation and understanding, with the hope that it will lead to a brighter future for all." The council members nodded in agreement, though their expressions were still guarded. Mark could feel the tension in the room begin to ease, though he knew that the battle was far from over. He had won a small victory, but the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. As the council meeting adjourned, Mark felt a sense of both relief and apprehension. He had made his case, and for now he had been granted the opportunity to stay. But he knew that his every move would be watched, that any misstep could bring everything crashing down. As he left the chamber, Queen Zephyra caught his eye, her expression filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Mark nodded to her, silently thanking her for her support, before following Seraphis out of the room. The night air was cool as they stepped outside, the stars twinkling overhead in a clear sky. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening's events settle on his shoulders. "Are you all right?" Seraphis asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. Mark nodded, though he couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm fine, just a lot to take in." Seraphis regarded him for a moment before nodding. "You did well tonight, Mark. But remember, this is just the beginning. There are many who still do not trust you, who will be waiting for any excuse to turn against you. Be careful." "I will," Mark promised, his resolve hardening. "I won't give them a reason to doubt me." Seraphis gave him a rare, faint smile. "Good. You'll need that determination in the days to come." As she turned to leave, Mark stood alone in the courtyard, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. He had faced the council, he had faced General Kyra, and he had come out the other side with a chance to prove himself, to build something meaningful on this world that had become his unexpected home. But he knew that the path ahead would not be easy. There were forces at play that he did not fully understand, undercurrents of tension and conflict that could erupt at any moment. He would need to be vigilant, to navigate the complexities of Eos's society with care and wisdom. And yet, despite the challenges, Mark felt a spark of hope. He had been given a chance to make a difference, to help build a bridge between two worlds that had long been divided. It was a daunting task, but it was one that he was determined to see through to the end. With a final glance at the night sky, Mark turned and made his way back to his quarters, his mind already turning to the work that lay ahead. He had been granted a reprieve, but the true test was only just beginning. As he closed the door behind him, Mark knew that the future of EOS and his own future would be shaped by the choices he made in the days to come. And he was ready to face whatever challenges awaited him with courage, determination, and the hope that he could help bring about a new era of peace and understanding on this beautiful, complex world. The days that followed the council meeting were marked by a mixture of tension and anticipation. Mark's agreement to work alongside the people of EOS had been met with varying degrees of skepticism and support. The decision to allow him to stay had, for the moment, quelled some of the unrest that had been brewing within the palace, but it was clear that the situation remained fragile. Mark threw himself into his new role, determined to prove his worth and gain the trust of those who doubted him. He began his days early, working side by side with the citizens of Elysium, learning their ways, and offering his assistance wherever he could. His tasks ranged from helping with agricultural projects in the vast gardens surrounding the city to assisting in the maintenance of the advanced technology that powered the palace and the city itself. Though the work was demanding, it provided him with a valuable opportunity to interact with the people of EOS on a more personal level. As Mark worked, he found that many of the women he encountered were curious about him, about Earth, his life as a soldier, and the technology that humans had developed. Some were cautious, keeping their distance and observing him with wary eyes, while others were more open, engaging him in conversation and even offering to teach him more about their own culture. These interactions, though sometimes awkward, helped to gradually ease the tension that had surrounded him since his arrival. However, not all of his encounters were so positive. There were still those who viewed him with suspicion, who saw his presence as a threat to their way of life. General Kyra and her followers were never far from his mind, their watchful eyes always present, their influence looming over every decision he made. Mark knew that he was being closely monitored, and any misstep could have dire consequences. Despite the challenges, Mark remained focused on his mission. He spent his evenings in the Hall of Records, poring over ancient texts and holographic displays, searching for answers to the questions that had haunted him since he first arrived on EOS. The more he learned about the planet's history, the more he realized how deeply the scars of the past had shaped the present. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that Mark stumbled upon something that would change everything. The Hall of Records was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the holographic displays as they flickered in the dim light. Mark sat at one of the consoles, his eyes scanning the lines of text and images that hovered before him. He had been working for hours, delving deeper into the history of EOS, in an attempt to understand the true nature of the conflict that had led to the separation of men and women. The records were extensive, detailing the events that had precipitated the war, the key figures involved, and the decisions that had ultimately led to the creation of the matriarchal society that now governed EOS. But as Mark sifted through the information, he began to notice gaps, missing files, inconsistencies in the accounts, and references to events that were never fully explained. Something wasn't right. Mark's curiosity was piqued. He had already learned that the history of EOS was complex and often shrouded in secrecy, but these omissions seemed deliberate, as if someone had intentionally erased or altered certain parts of the record. The more he searched, the more convinced he became that there was a hidden truth buried within the archives, a truth that had been kept from the people of EOS for centuries. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, Mark began to dig deeper, using the advanced search functions of the Hall's systems to cross-reference the existing records with what little he knew of the planet's history. It was slow, painstaking work, but gradually, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed to a hidden archive, a section of the Hall that was not accessible through the usual means. Mark's heart raced as he realized what he had uncovered. The Hall of Records was vast, with entire wings dedicated to specific periods of history, but it seemed that there was a section that had been deliberately concealed, its contents locked away from all but the most privileged members of society. If what he suspected was true, then this hidden archive might hold the answers he had been searching for: the truth about the war, about the decision to separate the sexes, and perhaps even about the fate of the men who had once lived on EOS. But accessing the hidden archive would not be easy. The security protocols surrounding it were advanced, designed to prevent unauthorized access. Mark knew that if he were caught trying to breach those protocols, the consequences could be severe. Yet the possibility of uncovering the truth, of finally understanding the full scope of the events that had shaped this world, was too tempting to resist. Taking a deep breath, Mark steeled himself for what he was about to do. He had already taken significant risks since arriving on EOS, but this was different. This was a gamble that could either reveal the secrets he sought or bring everything crashing down around him. With a few keystrokes, Mark initiated the override sequence, his fingers flying over the console as he bypassed the security protocols one by one. The system was sophisticated, but Mark's training as a soldier had included extensive experience with technology, experience that he now put to use as he worked to unlock the hidden archive. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity as the system resisted his efforts. But Mark persisted, his determination fueled by the knowledge that he was so close to uncovering the truth. Finally, with a soft chime, the last barrier fell, and the hidden archive was revealed. Mark exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding as the holographic display shifted, revealing a new set of files and records. These were different from the others, older, more fragmented, as if they had been deliberately obscured or corrupted over time. But they were there, and that was what mattered. As Mark began to sift through the newly revealed information, he quickly realized that he had indeed stumbled upon something significant. The hidden archive contained records that predated the war, accounts of a time when men and women had lived together on EOS in relative harmony. These records told a different story from the one Mark had been led to believe, a story of a society that had once been united, of men and women who had worked together to build a prosperous world. But the records also revealed something darker, something that had been carefully hidden from the people of EOS for centuries. The war, it seemed, had not been as simple as a conflict between men and women. It had been driven by a much deeper and more insidious force, one that had manipulated both sides, sowing discord and mistrust until the society was torn apart. The decision to separate the sexes had been made not out of a desire for peace, but out of fear of a power that had threatened to consume the entire planet. Mark's mind raced as he absorbed the information, piecing together the fragments of the past that had been hidden for so long. It became clear that the war had been orchestrated by a group of powerful individuals, men and women alike, who had sought to control the fate of EOS for their own purposes. These individuals had used the fear and anger generated by the conflict to justify the separation of the sexes, consolidating their power in the process. The records also hinted at the fate of the men who had been exiled from EOS. According to the hidden archive, many of them had not simply disappeared or died off, as the official history claimed. Instead, they had been driven underground, forced to live in secret, their existence denied by the ruling powers. Some had even left the planet, seeking refuge on distant worlds where they could live free from the oppression that had taken hold on EOS. As Mark read on, he felt a growing sense of outrage. The people of EOS had been lied to, their history rewritten to serve the interests of those in power. The truth had been buried, and the consequences of that deception had shaped the world into what it was today, a world where fear and mistrust had become the foundation of society. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In the deepest part of the hidden archive, Mark found references to an ancient technology, one that had been used during the war to control and manipulate the population. This technology, known as the Scepter of Dominion, had been a weapon of unimaginable power, capable of influencing the thoughts and emotions of those it was used upon. The records indicated that it had been employed by both sides during the conflict, driving the society to the brink of collapse. The Scepter of Dominion had been lost in the aftermath of the war, its existence erased from the official records. But the hidden archive suggested that it had not been destroyed. Instead, it had been hidden away, its location known only to a select few. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the implications of what he had discovered. If the Scepter of Dominion still existed, it could explain much of what had happened on EOS, how the society had been manipulated, how the separation of the sexes had been enforced, and why the truth had been buried for so long. But it also raised a terrifying possibility. If the scepter were to fall into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. The very fabric of EOS's society could be torn apart once again, and this time there might be no recovery. Mark knew that he couldn't keep this discovery to himself. The Queen needed to know, and so did those who still believed in the possibility of change. But he also knew that revealing the truth would be dangerous. There were those who would stop at nothing to keep the past buried, and they would see him as a threat to their power. As he stared at the glowing holographic display, Mark made a decision. He would go to Queen Zephyrah, share what he had found, and together they would determine the best course of action. The future of EOS depended on it. The palace was quiet as Mark made his way through the dimly lit corridors, the hidden archive's revelations weighing heavily on his mind. He knew that time was of the essence. Every moment he delayed was a moment in which the truth could be lost, or worse, used against the people of EOS. When he reached Queen Zephyrah's private chambers, he was greeted by Seraphis, who was standing guard outside the door. The commander of the Queen's Guard regarded him with her usual stoic expression, though there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice low, "what brings you here at this hour?" "I need to speak with the Queen," Mark replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "It's urgent." Seraphis studied him for a moment before nodding. "Wait here." She disappeared into the chamber, leaving Mark to pace anxiously in the hallway. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally the door opened again, and Seraphis gestured for him to enter. Mark stepped into the room, his heart pounding. Queen Zephyrah was seated by the window, the soft light of the moon casting a silver glow over her features. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Mark," she said, rising from her seat, "what is the matter?" Mark hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Your Majesty, I've discovered something that I believe you need to know. It's about the history of EOS and the war that led to the separation of the sexes." Zephyrah's eyes widened slightly, and she gestured for him to sit. "Tell me everything." Mark recounted what he had found in the hidden archive, the secret history that had been concealed for centuries. He spoke of the manipulation that had driven the society to war, the deception that had led to the separation of men and women, and the existence of the Scepter of Dominion, a weapon of unimaginable power that had been used to control the population. As he spoke, Zephyrah listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When he finished, there was a long silence as she processed the information. "This is incredible," she said finally, her voice filled with a mix of awe and horror. "If what you've discovered is true, then everything we've been taught, everything we've built our society on is a lie." Mark nodded, his heart heavy. "I know. And if the Scepter of Dominion still exists, it could pose a great danger to EOS. We need to find it, and we need to ensure that it can never be used again." Zephyra rose from her seat and began to pace the room, her mind clearly racing. "This changes everything," she murmured. "If the people were to learn the truth, it could destabilize our entire society. But at the same time, we cannot continue to live in ignorance. The past must be confronted, and the truth must be revealed." She stopped and turned to face Mark, her expression resolute. "We must act quickly, Mark. The longer we wait, the greater the risk that this information will be discovered by those who would use it for their own gain. We need to find the scepter, and we need to do it before anyone else does." Mark nodded, his determination matching hers. "What do you suggest, Your Majesty?" Zephyra took a deep breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We will need to keep this investigation secret, at least for now. Only a few trusted individuals should be involved. Seraphis, of course, will lead the effort to locate the scepter. We will also need access to certain restricted areas of the palace, as well as the cooperation of the scholars who maintain the Hall of Records." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Mark, I want you to be a part of this. Your knowledge of technology, combined with what you've already discovered, will be invaluable. Will you help us?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll do whatever it takes." Zephyra smiled, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mark. Your courage and dedication have already proven invaluable, and I am confident that together we can uncover the truth and protect EOS from those who would seek to control it." She turned to the door and called for Seraphis, who entered the room with her usual calm demeanor. The Queen quickly briefed her on what Mark had discovered, and the commander's expression grew more serious with each word. "This is a grave matter," Seraphis said once Zephyra had finished. "We must proceed with caution. If what Mark says is true, then the Scepter of Dominion could be the key to understanding everything that has happened on EOS, and it could also be the greatest threat we've ever faced." Zephyra nodded. "That is why we must act quickly and quietly. Seraphis, I want you to assemble a small team of trusted individuals who can assist in this investigation. We will begin our search immediately." Seraphis bowed her head in acknowledgement. "It will be done, Your Majesty." With that, the three of them began to plan their next steps. Mark shared everything he had learned from the hidden archive, providing key details that would guide their search. They discussed potential locations where the scepter might be hidden, drawing on the ancient texts and records that Mark had uncovered. As the night wore on, the plan began to take shape. It would be a dangerous mission, requiring them to venture into the most secret and restricted parts of the palace and possibly beyond. But they knew that they had no choice. The future of EOS depended on their success. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, their preparations were complete. Mark, Zephyra, and Seraphis stood together, united by a common purpose. "We will begin tonight," Zephyra said, her voice filled with determination. "The search for the Scepter of Dominion begins now, and with it, the search for the truth." Mark nodded, feeling a surge of resolve. He had come to EOS as an outsider, but now he was part of something much larger, something that could change the course of history. The challenges ahead would be great, but he was ready to face them. As they left the Queen's chambers, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The hidden truths of EOS were finally beginning to emerge, and with them, the possibility of a new future one, where the people of EOS could finally confront their past and build a better world. But as he walked through the silent halls of the palace, Mark also knew that they were not alone in this endeavor. There were others who would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried, others who would see the return of the Scepter of Dominion as an opportunity to seize power. The battle for the future of EOS had begun, and Mark was determined to see it through to the end. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city of Elysium was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Mark and Seraphis made their way to a secluded section of the palace. They had chosen this time to begin their search, knowing that the cover of darkness would offer them some measure of protection from prying eyes. Seraphis had assembled a small team of trusted individuals, all members of the Queen's Guard who were known for their loyalty and discretion. They were waiting for them at the entrance to an old, rarely used part of the palace, a place that had been largely forgotten over the centuries, its secrets hidden away in the shadows. As they approached, Seraphis gave a series of hand signals, instructing her team to take up positions around the area. The guards moved silently, their movements precise and coordinated, a testament to their training and discipline. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for the commander and her team. They were formidable, and he was grateful to have them on his side. This section of the palace has been sealed off for decades, Seraphis explained quietly as they reached the entrance. It was once part of the old archives, but it fell into disuse after the new Hall of Records was constructed. The Queen and the First believe that if the Scepter of Dominion is hidden within the palace, it could be in this area. Mark nodded, understanding the logic behind their decision. The old archives would be the perfect place to conceal something as dangerous as the scepter, a place that had been forgotten by most, where few would think to look. Seraphis gestured to one of her guards, who stepped forward and began to work on the sealed door. The ancient mechanism was rusted and corroded, but after a few tense moments, it finally gave way, creaking open to reveal a dark corridor beyond. Mark and Seraphis exchanged a glance before stepping through the doorway, their footsteps echoing softly in the narrow passage. The air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of dust and decay, and the walls were lined with crumbling stone, their surfaces etched with faded symbols and inscriptions. As they moved deeper into the old archives, the darkness seemed to close in around them, the only light coming from the small, handheld devices that Mark and Seraphis carried. The corridor twisted and turned, leading them through a labyrinth of forgotten chambers and storage rooms, each one filled with relics of the past, old scrolls, crumbling books, and artifacts that had not seen the light of day in centuries. But there was no sign of the scepter. After what felt like hours of searching, they reached a dead end, a large chamber with high, vaulted ceilings and walls lined with ancient tapestries. The room was empty, save for a large stone pedestal in the center, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. "This is it," Seraphis said quietly, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "The heart of the old archives." Mark approached the pedestal, his eyes scanning the room for any clues. The stone surface was worn and weathered, but as he wiped away the dust, he noticed something: a series of intricate carvings that formed a circular pattern, like a wheel or a seal. He examined the carvings closely, his mind racing as he tried to decipher their meaning. There was something familiar about the pattern, something that reminded him of the records he had seen in the hidden archive. And then it clicked. "It's a seal," Mark said, his voice filled with realization. "A seal designed to protect something powerful." Seraphis stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carvings. "Are you sure?" Mark nodded. "I've seen something like this before, in the hidden archive. It's a method of safeguarding dangerous artifacts, a way to ensure that they can only be accessed by those who know how to unlock the seal." Seraphis glanced at him, her expression serious. "Can you unlock it?" Mark hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think so, but it's going to take time and we'll need to be careful. If the scepter is really here, we don't know what kind of safeguards might have been put in place to protect it." Seraphis nodded in understanding. "Do what you need to do. We'll keep watch." With that, Mark set to work, carefully examining the seal and the carvings that adorned the pedestal. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the knowledge that he was standing on the precipice of something that could change everything. As he worked, the chamber seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft sound of Mark's tools as he carefully manipulated the ancient mechanism. Minutes stretched into hours, and still, Mark persisted, his focus unwavering. The seal was complex, designed to thwart anyone who might try to access the scepter without the proper knowledge. But Mark's training and experience, combined with the information he had gleaned from the hidden archive, gave him the edge he needed. Finally, with a soft click, the seal began to shift. The carvings on the pedestal glowed faintly, the circular pattern rotating as the ancient mechanism responded to Mark's efforts. Slowly, the top of the pedestal slid open, revealing a hidden compartment within. Mark and Seraphis exchanged a tense glance before Mark reached into the compartment, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the object within. It was a scepter, Just as the records had described a long, slender rod made of a dark, metallic material, its surface etched with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. At the top of the scepter was a large, multifaceted crystal that glowed with a soft, eerie radiance. The Scepter of Dominion. Mark felt a surge of awe and dread as he held the ancient artifact in his hands. The power contained within the scepter was palpable, a force that seemed to hum with its own malevolent energy. He knew that this was no ordinary weapon. This was a tool of control, a device that had the potential to reshape minds, to bend the will of those who came under its influence. Seraphis stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the scepter. "Is that it?" Mark nodded, his voice filled with a mixture of reverence and fear. "Yes, this is the Scepter of Dominion." For a moment the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. The implications of what they had found were staggering, and both of them knew that this was only the beginning. "What do we do now?" Seraphis asked, her voice low. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need to take this to the Queen. She needs to know what we've found, and we need to decide what to do with it." Seraphis nodded in agreement, her expression serious. "Agreed. But we must be cautious. If word of this gets out..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew the dangers that lay ahead, the forces that would stop at nothing to obtain the scepter and use its power for their own ends. As they carefully concealed the scepter and prepared to leave the chamber, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that even now, in the depths of the old archives, they were not alone. But there was no time to dwell on those fears. They had a mission to complete, and the future of EOS depended on their success. With the scepter safely in their possession, Mark and Seraphis made their way back through the dark corridors of the palace, their hearts pounding with the knowledge of what they had uncovered. The battle for the future of EOS was only just beginning, and Mark knew that the choices they made in the coming days would determine the fate of an entire world. But for now they had taken the first step, a step that would bring them closer to the truth and closer to the dawn of a new era for EOS. And as they emerged from the shadows and into the light of the palace, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, a hope that, despite the challenges ahead, they would find a way to heal the wounds of the past and build a better future for all. The discovery of the Scepter of Dominion had sent shockwaves through the palace, though only a select few were privy to the earth-shattering revelation. Mark, Queen Zephyra, Seraphis, and a handful of trusted individuals now carried the weight of a secret that could alter the course of EOS's future. As the days passed, the gravity of their situation became increasingly clear. The scepter was not just a relic of the past, it was a weapon of unimaginable power, one that could either destroy or save their world, depending on how it was used. Queen Zephyra, ever the wise and cautious leader, had ordered the scepter to be hidden in a secure location within the palace, its existence known only to those directly involved in its discovery. Seraphis had personally overseen its concealment, ensuring that no one outside their circle could access it. But even with these precautions, there was an unspoken fear that gnawed at them, all the knowledge that others might seek the scepter for their own purposes, and the potential consequences if it fell into the wrong hands. Mark spent his days in a state of heightened vigilance, his mind constantly racing with the implications of what they had found. He continued to work alongside the people of EOS, carrying out his duties with a sense of purpose that had only deepened since the discovery. But the tension was always there, a persistent undercurrent that colored every interaction, every decision. The people of EOS, for their part, were unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Life in Elysium continued as it always had, the city's inhabitants going about their daily routines with a sense of calm that belied the turmoil hidden within the palace walls. Yet there were signs that change was coming, small, subtle shifts in the way people spoke, the way they looked at Mark. It was as if the very air had become charged with the anticipation of something momentous, something that could not be ignored. The tension reached a boiling point one evening when Queen Zephyra summoned Mark to her private chambers. The Queen's messages had always been delivered with a sense of urgency, but this time there was something different, a note of finality that made Mark's heart skip a beat. He knew that whatever the Queen had to say, it would mark a turning point in their journey. When Mark arrived at the Queen's chambers, he was greeted by Seraphis, who stood guard at the entrance with her usual stoic expression. The commander nodded to him as he approached, her eyes reflecting the same resolve that had carried them through their previous trials. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of the tension she usually kept so well hidden, "the Queen is waiting for you. Be prepared for what she has to say." Mark nodded, his pulse quickening as he entered the chamber. Zephyra was seated near the window, her posture regal yet relaxed, as if she had spent hours in contemplation. The soft light of the setting sun bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The atmosphere was serene, almost peaceful, but Mark could sense the turmoil that lay beneath the surface. "Your Majesty," he greeted her, bowing his head in respect. Zephyra looked up at him, her expression a mixture of warmth and sadness. "Mark," she said softly, gesturing for him to sit beside her, "please join me." Mark did as she asked, taking a seat in the chair opposite her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Finally, Zephyra spoke, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had always defined her. "I have been thinking a great deal about what we discovered," she began, her gaze distant as if she were looking out over a vast horizon. "The scepter of dominion is a relic of a dark time in our history. A time when our people were divided and manipulated by those who sought power at any cost. Its existence is a reminder of the worst that we are capable of, a reminder that we must never allow ourselves to fall into such a state again." Mark nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "But it's also a chance to make things right," he said gently. "We have the opportunity to reveal the truth, to confront the past and ensure that it never repeats itself." Zephyra's eyes met his, and for a moment, Mark saw the depth of her inner struggle, the conflict between her desire to protect her people and her recognition of the need for change. "You are right," Mark, she said after a pause. "But the path forward is fraught with danger. There are those who would use the scepter for their own purposes, who would seek to control or destroy rather than to heal. If the truth is revealed, it could destabilize our society, and the consequences could be catastrophic." Mark felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "What do you propose we do, Your Majesty?" Zephyra was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge the depth of his resolve. "I believe," she said finally, her voice firm, "that we must take a bold step, a step that will require great courage and trust. The truth must be revealed, but it must be done in a way that unites our people rather than divides them." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. "How?" Zephyra took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for the enormity of what she was about to propose. "We will hold a public gathering, a council of all the leaders of EOS, from every region, every city. We will bring them here to Elysium, and together we will reveal the truth of our history. We will present the scepter of dominion as evidence of the manipulation that has shaped our society. And we will call upon our people to confront the past and choose a new path forward, one that embraces unity rather than division." Mark stared at her, his mind racing with the implications of what she was suggesting. "Your Majesty, that's incredibly risky. There are so many things that could go wrong. What if the leaders don't agree? What if they react with anger or fear? What if?" Zephyra held up a hand, stopping his words with a gentle yet firm gesture. "I know, Mark, I am fully aware of the risks, but I believe that it is the only way forward. We cannot continue to live in the shadow of lies and deceit. Our people deserve to know the truth, and they deserve the opportunity to choose their own future." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He knew that Zephyra was right. Hiding the truth would only perpetuate the cycle of fear and mistrust that had plagued EOS for centuries. But the idea of revealing the scepter to the entire planet, of confronting the full weight of their history in such a public way, was daunting. "You're asking for a lot of trust, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "Not just from your people, but from the leaders of EOS, from those who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo." Zephyra nodded, her expression grave. "I am. But I believe that it is a trust that we must extend, if we are to have any hope of healing the wounds of the past. We cannot build a better future on a foundation of lies." Mark couldn't argue with that. He knew, deep down, that Zephyra's plan was the right one, that it was the only way to truly break free from the chains of their history. But he also knew that it would be one of the greatest challenges they had ever faced. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. Zephyra smiled, a look of gratitude and relief in her eyes. I need you to stand by my side, Mark. You have been a beacon of hope and courage since the day you arrived on EOS. Your presence, your willingness to learn and to contribute, has already made a difference in the lives of many. I believe that your voice will carry weight with the people. That they will see in you the possibility of a new future, one where men and women can once again live in harmony. Mark felt a surge of emotion at her words. He had never imagined that he would play such a pivotal role in the fate of an entire planet, but now he knew that this was where he was meant to be. I'll do whatever it takes, Your Majesty, he said firmly. I'm with you, every step of the way. Zephyr reached out and placed a hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. Thank you, Mark. Together we will face whatever challenges lie ahead, and we will do so with the knowledge that we are fighting for a better world, a world where the truth is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The days leading up to the gathering were a whirlwind of activity. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of EOS, summoning the leaders of the various regions to Elysium. The palace was a hive of preparation, with courtiers and guards working tirelessly to ensure that everything was ready for the momentous event. Mark, Zephyra, and Seraphis worked closely together, coordinating the logistics and planning the sequence of events. They knew that the gathering would be a delicate balance of diplomacy and revelation, and that every detail had to be carefully considered. The risks were high, but so were the stakes. As the day of the gathering approached, a sense of anticipation and tension settled over the city of Elysium. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. Rumors and speculation ran rampant, with many wondering what could be so important that the Queen had called for such a gathering. On the morning of the gathering, Mark stood with Zephyra and Seraphis in a private chamber, going over the final details of their plan. The Queen was calm and composed, her regal bearing unshaken by the enormity of what they were about to do. Seraphis, ever the soldier, was focused and methodical, ensuring that every aspect of security had been accounted for. Mark, on the other hand, felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He knew that this was a pivotal moment, not just for EOS but for himself as well. The choices they made today would determine the future of the planet, and there was no turning back. Are you ready? Mark, Zephyra asked, her voice gentle but firm. Mark took a deep breath and nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Zephyra smiled, a look of pride in her eyes. You have come so far, Mark. When you first arrived on EOS, I never could have imagined that you would play such an important role in our future. But now I can't imagine doing this without you. Mark felt a lump in his throat at her words. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'm honored to stand by your side. Seraphis stepped forward, her expression serious. It's time. The leaders have gathered, and the people are waiting. Zephyra nodded, her gaze steady. Then let us begin. The Grand Hall of Elysium was a vast, opulent space, its walls adorned with intricate tapestries and carvings that depicted the history of EOS. The room was filled with representatives from every region of the planet, leaders, scholars, warriors, and citizens alike. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the anticipation of what was to come. At the front of the hall stood a raised platform, where Queen Zephyra, Mark, and Seraphis took their places. The Queen's presence commanded the attention of the entire room, her regal bearing and calm demeanor a source of reassurance for all who were present. As the hall fell into a hushed silence, Zephyra stepped forward, her voice carrying with a quiet strength that resonated throughout the space. My people. She began, we are gathered here today to confront a truth that has been hidden from us for far too long, a truth that has shaped our society, our history, and our very way of life. The crowd listened intently, their eyes fixed on the Queen as she continued. For centuries we have lived under the belief that the separation of men and women was a necessary measure to preserve our peace and stability. We have been told that the war between the sexes was inevitable, that it was the only way to protect our world from destruction. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but Zephyra raised her hand, signaling for silence. But what if I told you that this belief was based on a lie? What if I told you that our history has been manipulated, that the conflict that tore our society apart was not a natural consequence, but a deliberate act of control? The murmurs grew louder, the crowd shifting uneasily as Zephyra's words began to sink in. Mark could see the confusion and fear in their eyes, the uncertainty that came with questioning everything they had ever known. Zephyra continued, her voice unwavering. "What we are about to reveal to you will challenge everything you have been taught. But it is a truth that must be faced if we are to move forward as a united people, a truth that will require us to confront the past, to acknowledge the mistakes that have been made, and to choose a new path for the future." She turned to Mark, her gaze filled with trust and determination. Mark Danner, a man from another world, has played a crucial role in uncovering this truth. He has shown us that there is value in seeking understanding, in bridging the divide that has separated us for so long. And now, he will share with you what we have discovered. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the eyes of the entire room on him. He knew that this was the moment they had been working toward, the moment that would determine the future of EOS. Taking a deep breath, Mark began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "People of EOS, when I first arrived on your planet, I was a stranger and outsider who knew nothing of your history, your culture, or your struggles. But as I have lived and worked among you, I have come to see the beauty and strength of your society. I have also come to understand the pain and fear that has shaped your world, and the deep wounds that have yet to heal." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Through my time here, I have uncovered a hidden truth, a truth that reveals the manipulation and deceit that has shaped your history. The war that tore your society apart was not a natural consequence of differences between men and women. It was orchestrated by those who sought power, those who used fear and division to control the population." The crowd was silent, their expressions a mix of shock, disbelief, and growing concern. Mark could feel the weight of their emotions, the collective realization that their world was not what they had believed it to be. "But there is more," Mark said, his voice growing stronger. "We have discovered an artifact from that time, a weapon known as the Scepter of Dominion. This scepter was used to manipulate the minds and emotions of your ancestors, to drive them to war, and to enforce the separation of the sexes. It is a weapon of unimaginable power, one that has been hidden for centuries, and one that must never be used again." He turned to Seraphis, who stepped forward and revealed the scepter, its dark, metallic surface glinting in the light. The crowd gasped, their eyes widening as they took in the sight of the ancient artifact. "This is the Scepter of Dominion," Mark said, his voice filled with resolve. "It is a symbol of the lies and manipulation that have shaped your history. But it is also a reminder that we have the power to choose a different path, a path of unity, understanding, and trust." There was a moment of stunned silence, the crowd processing the enormity of what had been revealed. Then, slowly the murmurs began to rise again, the room filled with the sound of voices debating, questioning, and reacting to the truth that had been laid before them. Zephyria stepped forward once more, her voice commanding the attention of the room. "We have come to a crossroads, my people. We can choose to continue living in the shadow of the past, to allow fear and mistrust to dictate our future, or we can choose to confront the truth, to acknowledge the mistakes that have been made, and to build a new society, one where men and women can live together in harmony as they once did." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The choice is ours to make, but know this: whatever path we choose, we must do so together as one people. For only through unity can we ensure a future where the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and where the truth is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced." The room fell silent once more, the weight of Zephyra's words settling over the crowd like a heavy mantle. Mark could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the struggle to reconcile the truth with the reality they had always known. And then slowly something remarkable began to happen. One by one, members of the crowd began to stand, their expressions resolute and filled with a quiet determination. They were the leaders of EOS, the representatives of the various regions and cities, and their decision to stand was a powerful symbol of their willingness to embrace the truth and to seek a new path forward. As more and more leaders stood, the atmosphere in the room shifted, the tension giving way to a sense of hope and possibility. The murmurs of fear and doubt were replaced by a growing sense of resolve, a collective understanding that the time for change had come. Mark felt a surge of emotion as he watched the scene unfold, knowing that they had taken the first step toward healing the wounds of the past. It would not be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time there was a sense of unity, a sense that the people of EOS were ready to confront their history and to build a better future together. Zephyra's voice rang out once more, filled with pride and determination. Together, we will build a new dawn for EOS-1 where the mistakes of the past are not forgotten, but are used to guide us toward a brighter future. We will stand united as one people, and we will face whatever challenges lie ahead with the knowledge that we are stronger together. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in a chorus of support and solidarity. The energy in the room was electric, a palpable sense of hope and determination that filled the space and lifted the spirits of all who were present. As the applause continued, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him, a deep and abiding certainty that they had done the right thing. The truth had been revealed, and the people of EOS had chosen to embrace it, to confront the past, and to work together to build a better future. And as he stood there, surrounded by the leaders and citizens of EOS, Mark knew that this was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, still many challenges to overcome, but they had taken the first step toward a new era, an era where the truth was not something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. As the gathering began to disperse, the leaders and citizens of EOS returning to their homes and their regions with a renewed sense of purpose, Mark remained by Zephyrah's side, his heart filled with gratitude and hope. "Thank you," Mark, Zephyrah said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "You have helped us find the courage to face the truth, and for that I am eternally grateful." Mark smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "It was an honor, Your Majesty. But this is just the beginning. There's still so much to do, so much to rebuild. But I know that together we can create something truly extraordinary." Zephyrah nodded, her gaze filled with resolve. "Yes, we can, and we will." As the sun set over the city of Elysium, casting a warm, golden light over the palace and the surrounding landscape, Mark felt a deep sense of peace, a peace that came from knowing that they had taken the first step toward healing the wounds of the past and building a brighter future for all. The new dawn for EOS had begun, and with it, the promise of a future where truth, unity, and hope would guide them toward a better world. And as Mark looked out over the city, his heart filled with gratitude and determination, he knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, a journey that he was honored to be a part of, and one that he would see through to the end. The events of the Grand Gathering had marked a turning point in the history of EOS. The revelations about the Scepter of Dominion and the manipulated past had been met with shock and disbelief, but also with a resolve to forge a new path forward. In the days and weeks that followed, the leaders of EOS returned to their respective regions, spreading the message of unity and truth. It was a time of reflection, of difficult conversations and soul-searching, but also of hope, a hope that for the first time in centuries, the people of EOS could build a future free from the shadows of their past. Mark Danner found himself at the center of this transformation. His role in uncovering the truth and standing beside Queen Zephyrah had earned him the respect and admiration of many, but it had also placed a tremendous burden on his shoulders. He had become a symbol of change, of the possibility of a world where men and women could once again coexist in harmony. It was a role he had never sought, but one he accepted with humility and determination. The days that followed the gathering were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Mark, Zephyrah, and Seraphis worked tirelessly to guide the transition, helping to establish new structures of governance, new channels of communication, and new ways of thinking about the relationship between men and women. It was a daunting task, and there were moments of doubt and fear, but the overwhelming sense of purpose drove them forward. One of the first challenges they faced was how to address the existence of the Scepter of Dominion. The artifact, with its immense power to control and manipulate, was a relic of a dark time that had no place in the new society they were trying to build. After much deliberation, Zephyrah and her council made the decision to destroy the scepter, ensuring that its power could never again be used to harm or control the people of EOS. The ceremony to destroy the scepter was a somber and symbolic event. It took place in the heart of Elysium, in the very chamber where it had been discovered. Mark, Zephyrah, Seraphis, and a select group of leaders gathered to witness the destruction, understanding the gravity of the moment. The scepter, once a tool of oppression, was to be consigned to history, its power forever extinguished. As the scepter was placed on a stone pedestal, the gathered leaders formed a circle around it, their expressions solemn. Zephyrah, holding a ceremonial blade made of the same ancient metal as the scepter, stepped forward to deliver the final blow. With this act, she declared, her voice filled with resolve, "We put an end to the legacy of fear and control that has plagued our world for centuries. Let this be a symbol of our commitment to truth, unity, and peace. The past will no longer dictate our future." With a swift and precise motion, Zephyra brought the blade down on the scepter. The metal shattered with a sharp, ringing sound, and the crystal at its tip disintegrated into dust. A wave of energy pulsed through the room, the remnants of the scepter's power dissipating into the air, leaving behind only a sense of finality. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the event settling over those present. Then, slowly, a sense of relief and closure began to spread among them. The scepter was no more, and with its destruction, a dark chapter in the history of EOS had come to an end. Mark felt a profound sense of peace as he watched the dust of the scepter settle on the stone. It was as if a great burden had been lifted, not just from his shoulders, but from the entire planet. The path forward was still uncertain, but they had taken the first step together. In the months that followed, the transition to a new era continued. The process was not without its challenges, as the deeply ingrained beliefs and fears of the past were not easily undone. There were those who resisted the changes, who clung to the old ways out of fear or a desire to maintain their power. But the momentum for change was unstoppable, driven by the resolve of the people and the leadership of Queen Zephyra and her allies. Mark played a crucial role in this transition. His presence, as a man who had come from a different world, served as a powerful reminder that coexistence was possible. He traveled across EOS, meeting with leaders and citizens, listening to their concerns, and sharing his vision for a united society. His sincerity, humility, and dedication won him many allies, and his influence helped to ease the fears of those who were uncertain about the future. One of the most significant changes that emerged during this time was the gradual reintegration of men into Eosian society. The discovery of hidden communities of men who had been living in exile or in secret added a new dimension to the process of reconciliation. Many of these men had lived in fear and isolation for generations, cut off from the rest of society by the lies and manipulation that had shaped EOS. Now they were being offered a chance to return to be part of the new world that was being built. The process was slow and delicate, as both men and women had to overcome centuries of mistrust and fear. But with the guidance of leaders like Zephyra and Mark, the reintegration began to take shape. Men were welcomed back into the cities and communities of EOS, given opportunities to contribute to the rebuilding and to share in the responsibilities of governance and society. Mark's own journey during this time was one of self-discovery and growth. He found himself increasingly drawn to the people of EOS, their resilience, and their determination to build a better future. He also found himself drawn to Queen Zephyra in a way that went beyond mere admiration. The bond they had formed during their time together had deepened, and it was clear to both of them that their relationship was evolving into something more. It was during one of their many late-night conversations, after a long day of meetings and negotiations, that the unspoken feelings between them finally came to the surface. They were sitting in Zephyra's private garden, a secluded space filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the soft glow of bioluminescent plants. The air was cool, and the stars above them twinkled in the clear night sky. "Mark," Zephyra began, her voice soft and contemplative, "when you first arrived on EOS, I saw you as an outsider, someone who could never fully understand our world, our struggles. But you have proven me wrong in so many ways. You have shown us the strength that comes from seeking understanding, from building bridges instead of walls. I have come to respect and admire you more than I ever thought possible." Mark smiled, his heart warming at her words. "And I have come to respect and admire you, Your Majesty. You've shown me what it means to be a true leader, to make difficult decisions, to stand by your people, even when the path is uncertain. I've learned so much from you." Zephyra turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotion. "We have both grown during this journey, Mark. But there is something I must tell you, something I have been wrestling with for some time." Mark felt a flutter of anticipation in his chest. "What is it?" Zephyra hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Mark, I care for you deeply, more than I ever expected to. But I know that you have a life beyond EOS, a life on Earth that you may wish to return to. I do not want to stand in the way of your happiness, but I must also be honest with you about my feelings." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had known that there was a growing connection between them, but hearing her speak the words aloud made it all the more real. "Zephyra," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I care for you too. I've thought about my life on Earth, about what I left behind, but the truth is, I found something here, something I never expected. I found a purpose, a place where I feel I belong, and I found you." Zephyra's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Are you saying?" Mark reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I'm saying that I don't want to leave EOS. I want to stay here with you and help build the future we've been working toward. I want to be by your side, Zephyra, not just as an ally, but as something more." Zephyra's expression softened, a smile spreading across her face. "Mark, you have no idea how much those words mean to me. I have long carried the weight of leadership, the burden of making decisions for the good of our people. But with you, I feel something different, something that goes beyond duty or responsibility. I feel hope." Mark's heart swelled with emotion as he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's build that future together, Zephyra. Let's face whatever challenges come our way, and let's do it as partners, as equals." Zephyra's smile widened, and she squeezed his hand gently. "Yes, Mark, let's do that, together." As they sat there in the quiet of the garden, the connection between them solidified into something deep and unbreakable, a bond that went beyond words, beyond titles, and beyond the challenges they had faced. It was a bond built on trust, respect, and the shared belief that they could create a better world together. The following years saw EOS undergo a profound transformation. The process of reintegration and reconciliation was not without its difficulties, but the determination of the people, guided by the leadership of Queen Zephyra and Mark, ensured that progress continued. Slowly but surely, the old divisions began to heal, and a new sense of unity emerged. Mark and Zephyra's relationship became a beacon of hope for the people of EOS, a symbol of the possibility of a new era where men and women could live together in harmony. Their partnership, both personal and political, became the foundation of the new society that was taking shape. Together, they worked to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated, that the truth was always valued, and that the people of EOS had a voice in shaping their future. As the years passed, Mark became fully integrated into Eosian society. He took on a formal role as an advisor and diplomat, working closely with Zephyra and the Council to address the challenges that arose. His knowledge of Earth's technology and governance proved invaluable, helping to bridge the gap between the two worlds and bringing new ideas and innovations to EOS. The people of EOS, once divided by fear and mistrust, began to embrace the new era of cooperation and understanding. The reintegration of men into society brought new perspectives and skills, enriching the culture and strengthening the bonds between communities. The old wounds, while not forgotten, were slowly healing, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and collective responsibility. Mark and Zephyra's love story became the stuff of legend, a tale that was told and retold across the planet. Their partnership was seen as a symbol of the new EOS, a world where differences were celebrated, where truth and unity were the guiding principles, and where the future was shaped by the collective will of the people. In time, Mark and Zephyra started a family, raising their children with the values they had fought so hard to uphold. Their children, born into a world that was still learning to embrace its new identity, became the next generation of leaders, carrying forward the legacy of their parents and continuing the work of building a better future for all. As Mark looked back on his journey, from the moment he had crash-landed on EOS to the present, he marveled at the twists and turns his life had taken. He had arrived on this planet as a soldier, a man without a home or a purpose. But he had found something far greater than he ever could have imagined. He had found love, purpose, and a place where he truly belonged. The story of Mark Danner and Queen Zephyra became a cornerstone of Eosian history, a testament to the power of truth, unity, and the belief that even the most entrenched divisions could be overcome. Their legacy was one of hope, a reminder that the future was not set in stone but was shaped by the choices and actions of those who had the courage to confront the past and build something better. And as the sun set over the city of Elysium, casting a warm, golden light over the palace and the surrounding landscape, Mark knew that the new dawn for EOS had truly begun. It was a dawn that promised a future where the mistakes of the past were not forgotten but were used as lessons to guide them forward, a future where the people of EOS, united and strong, could face whatever challenges lay ahead with confidence and hope. Mark and Zephyra stood together on the balcony of the palace, their hands entwined as they looked out over the city they had worked so hard to rebuild. The sounds of laughter and music drifted up from the streets below, a celebration of the new era that was unfolding before them. "This is what we've been working toward," Zephyra said softly, her voice filled with contentment. "A world where our children can grow up without the fear and mistrust that once divided us." Mark nodded, his heart filled with pride and gratitude. "And it's just the beginning, Zephyra. There's so much more to come, so much more we can achieve together." Zephyra turned to him, her eyes filled with love and determination. "Yes, Mark, together we can achieve anything." And as they stood there, side by side, watching the first stars appear in the night sky, Mark knew that the journey was far from over. But he also knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together stronger, wiser, and united in their shared vision of a better future for all the people of EOS. The legacy of Mark and Zephyra was one of hope, love, and the belief that the future was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced with open arms. It was a legacy that would endure for generations, a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of a new dawn. And as the night settled over Elysium, the stars shining brightly above, Mark and Zephyra looked to the future with hope in their hearts, knowing that the best was yet to come.